The scripture that we heard read by Jan just a moment ago talks about that God has a gift for each of us to be exercised in a form of ministry, and that's our theme today, ministry, the calling that we're all given. The gospel this morning continues that theme using the imagery of fruit-bearing trees, how their intention is to give themselves away. I invite you to rise for its reading as we hear it from John chapter 15. Jesus speaking, "Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, and you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you, so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete." The gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. What on earth are we here for? Today we're talking about our calling to ministry. Jesus said, "Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit." What we're talking about today is a ministry that gives a special kind of a joy, of all things, when we give ourselves away. That's what we're calling fruitful living. Finding our gifts and acknowledging our gifts and giving our gifts away is not always easy. Sometimes we don't even know when it happens. Hear about the pastor that went out to North Dakota after seminary? He wasn't sure what he was going to do. He was kind of a shy guy, and he went out to this farming country called Mott, North Dakota. And after being there for some time, he found out that preaching was not his thing, and the people in the congregation, they knew that. They also saw that he was not really good at communicating with people on the streets, and his communication skills were lacking, and they were starting to wonder about him as their pastor. And one of the faithful farmers of the community found this pastor alone. He said, "Pastor, I'm just curious. How in the world did you find yourself becoming a pastor?" I think he had a motive behind that. And the pastor said, "Well, to be honest with you, I was laying out on my yard, and I looked up in the sky, and there was as clear as all get out. The clouds were in the formation of three initials, GPC. And he said, right away, I said to myself, that's God saying to me, go preach Christ. And the next day I applied for seminary, and here I am, your pastor." Well, this loving farmer looked him in the eye, and he says, "Well, with all due respects, Pastor, that initials GPC in the sky could have meant go plant corn." Finding our gifts is not always easy, and sometimes it's found in making some mistakes and changing course and finding our direction in college and after going a completely new direction, which is okay. And the reason is for that because we all have our own unique gifts. The Apostle Paul said that the Spirit gives gifts to God's people as the Spirit chooses. Folks, what that means is that there's a gift set that we've been given. We can fine-tune them and we can develop them, but if we try to develop a gift that was not originally ours, I think we're setting ourselves up for failure. To acknowledge that God has given to each of us gifts that were special for a purpose that God had in mind is something that it's good for us to accept as it is. Now, the Apostle Paul that we know in the Scriptures talked a lot about gifts. And he said there are different gifts that are given to all of us. And he said it's important for acknowledge that they're all different. The foot can't say to the hand, because you are not like me, you're not important anymore. No, we need both. And the eye can't say to the ear, I'm much more important than you are because I can do this and you can't do that. No, that's not the way it is. Our gifts are given to us in part so that as we come together as a community, our gifts come together, and that's where we find our fulfillment. Finding our place in ministry. Somehow discovering the way in which that God has called us with our unique gifts is something that is a challenge but so fulfilling. One of the temptations that we have when looking at our gifts is to do either of two things. One is that we can find ourselves comparing to others, and we say to ourselves, oh, these other people have such a better gift than I. They can do it so much better than I. And then they do what I call the Scandinavian shuffle, looking down at their feet. Oh, golly gee, I'm not very good about that. Folks, that's not helpful. But on the other end of the spectrum, we compare our gifts to other people. We can easily fall into the trap to say that, oh, I'm doing this a little bit better than they are. If only they did it like we did, and if only that church did it the way that our Saviour's Lutheran did it, boy, they would be right on track. Folks, we're going to get in trouble when we compare our gifts with the gifts of others. And the reason is because they're all different and to be exercised differently. God has given us our unique gifts for what the Apostle Paul said is for the common good. If we understand that correctly, folks, it's very, very important that we understand that the reason why God gave us gifts and gave us gifts that are meant to be only exercised in community, because we don't have all the gift sets that we need for ourselves, is that it's meant for the common good. It's for the other people. And so it is with the apple tree that is meant to produce apples. That apple tree would be useless if that would not let go of the apples and hung on to them, clung to them. No, it produces apples for the purposes of giving it away. Folks, God has given you and given me gifts. And when they're blended together for the common good, we make quite a difference in this world. But what is the motivation for us to share these gifts? Why in the world would we say that we have been given a special gift to be given away to somebody else? Well, we read about that in the gospel text today, when Jesus said, as the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. It is true that the apples that are borne by a tree take on the DNA of the trunk and the roots of that tree itself. And there isn't any surprise that the apples all look alike in that apple tree because it takes on the character of the trunk and the roots themselves. That's the way the nature of apples are, aren't they? They take on that which the trunk has prepared for it. When we are connected to Christ, when our branch is connected to Jesus and as the trunk of our tree, we shouldn't be surprised if we find ourselves asking questions like, I wonder how I can be a servant as Christ was a servant to his disciples in the world of his day. We shouldn't be surprised if we find ourselves saying, I wonder how I can creatively share the gifts that have been given to me, whether it's in Guatemala or in the inner city of St. Paul, or to the neighbor that's right next door. You see, when we have been captured by Christ's love, and somehow our lives have been so touched by the good news that we have been accepted just as we are, and as big of a stinker as Pastor Dan has ever been, he's still loved and forgiven. And God's grace says, Dan, you have a brand new start moving forward, and so do the rest of your friends. When we have been captured by that message and the branch of our life has been connected intimately to the grace of Christ, our lives start to take on the DNA of the one that we're connected to. Friends, that's good news, because we have to somehow create our own kind of ministry, because God has a way of opening up avenues for us that we never thought possible. You see, if connected to Jesus opens us up to give ourselves away, maybe that's why we as a congregation have, for the past 3 years, raised over $8,000 and sent a team of 18 to 25 people down to Guatemala to build a home for a poverty-stricken family that we don't even know. That's what I call bearing fruit in its finest moment. Maybe that's why we as a congregation supports a preschool for 40 years, When they could not sustain themselves, but our offerings that we give help make it possible. The reason why we do that is because we have a vision for what it means to nurture children and to let them find out how the love of Christ loves them and has a future for them. Maybe that's why we give ourselves to preschool ministry. Why do we send people down to inner city St. Paul every Thursday noon? Why do we prepare food for 200 to 300 people and give it away to people who couldn't afford to buy a meal on their own? It's because we see that as our apple tree giving the apples away the way that God intended us to be, giving for the common good, even if the common good is our brothers and sisters who live in poverty. My parents love to tell some stories over and over again, and this is one of their favorites. In the Nordin family, there's a lot of laughter and there's a lot of loud noise because they seem to communicate louder when there's more noise in the room. That doesn't happen in your families, I'm sure, just ours. But when I was 5 or 6 years of age, I was with the family, and there was always a conversation about politics or church life. And Uncle Art was the activist of the Nordin family, and he's the one who dumped milk on NFO days. If you're old enough to remember that, you understand who he is. And when Art had a position to share with you, his personal space is about 8 inches. And if you didn't agree with him, or you give the impression you didn't understand him, his personal space came down to about 3 inches until he was sure that you understood his position. Well, one day, when we're together at the Nordin family, and a complete hush fell over that gathering, and Art said a question that everyone could hear. He said, "Danny," that's what they were called back then, "are you a Republican or a Democrat?" Now, I'm sure you're waiting to hear my response now, aren't you? And I looked at Art and I said with all my innocence, "I am a Lutheran." And it brought the house down. Obviously, they could tell that I didn't have a clue what he was really asking about politics to a 5-year-old, for Pete's sake. But you know, thinking about that, maybe there's some wisdom in that ignorance. Maybe there's a kernel of real truth that is to be found for all of us during our climate of our political arena that we're all swimming in right now. Maybe it's okay for us to put aside the title of Republican or Democrat just long enough for us to remember who we are as God's children, and to remember that God has called each of us with special gifts for a special ministry in this world. And some of that does include the political world where we work together with others in our state and our nation, but others by ourselves. And if we're absolutely sure that God has called us to be a people who are to go out in the world and to wash people's feet, as Jesus did, and if we're sold on the fact that we heard Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead, and as Lazarus came out of the tomb, he was still wrapped in grave clothes, and he told his disciples, "It's your job now to go unwrap that person," as if to say, "I can give people life, but you're going to be a part of the process of setting them free." Friends, if we're sure that we've been marked with that kind of a cross, then go back into the political arena and ask different questions, not on the basis of their political party, but on the basis of, will this candidate do everything possible to make sure that education for the kids is going to be a high priority, and we will not cut so that our kids can discover who they are as God's beloved children, and let their gift grow and shift, and let them experiment with different things in athletics and fine arts and everything. Will this candidate support that or not? That's encouraging gifts. Will this candidate that we're listening to be able to say clearly that I am going to open up avenues so that the ministry gifts that each person has been given is going to be able to be encouraged to give their gifts away to help the poor and those who are underserved? Are we going to be a people who respond to Jesus' call to say no matter where the area of need is, whether the poverty in the sense of being without a home is in downtown St. Paul or in Liberia and in Somalia, wherever it is, that we can be set free to ask the question, how can we God's presence in this world that's in great need? Maybe that's the candidate, and forget about the title. Friends, as God's people that are being barraged by political messages, I think it's time for us to ask the serious question about who is going to lead us into an era of peace Who's going to be the candidate that's going to be serious about negotiating with people around the world and even within our country with people that they disagree with, that is going to be sure that we're going to do everything possible to make peace our absolute bottom line experience so that our children can experience their gifts in fullness of life, and then people who are not going to have to be looking, wondering if they're being watched or oppressed or somehow their gifts are going to be completely reprised. Jesus ends his discourse this morning saying that about abiding love and giving the gifts away. He says this, "These things I've said to you, that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete." Friends, how is your joy factor? How is your life from the inside? And I'm not talking about, is the paycheck enough? I'm talking about that inner sides of you that says, are you being fulfilled, and that the gifts that God has given to you exercise in ways in which that has brought forth a new and found joy? Maybe it's time for us to do some inventorying and maybe even encouragement to take some new avenues of life. You see, the joy of bearing fruit is the joy of finding ourselves in a community that is not always in agreement. It's a way in which that we can see ourselves as people who have lived in a community that is composed of Republicans and Democrats like this church. And it's composed of people who ride Harleys and they ride Hondas, and yes, even some ride Victory motorcycles. And some of the people in the church cheer for football teams that wear green and gold, and others cheer for teams that wear purple. It doesn't seem to make any difference. And the reason is because we have risen above our differences and acknowledged that there's differences, and we accept the differences, and we say that that's the way the beauty of the garden is greater because we have variety in here, but yet we're united with one cause, that we want each of us to have the freedom to exercise our gifts of ministry. Maybe that's why I love being your pastor so much. There's such an authentic joy that comes in this church. When I look around, and whether it's the musicians who give hours upon hours of time in leading music, and it's people who set up for hospitality, and people who set up for worship, and people who give their meals downtown St. Paul, there's such an authentic joy in this church. I know why now. Because you've risen above the differences and says that united with our gifts, we are going to make a difference. Could we for one more time join C.S. Lewis and be willing to be surprised by joy again? Surprised by a joy as we affirm our God-given gifts for ministry, however they have been given to us, and there find ourselves bearing fruit that is given away. Truly amazing. With all the gifts of ministry that God has given to this church and to each of us individually, when we give of them with the anticipation that God's Spirit is at work, we make a difference in this world, and there we discover joy again. Amen.